Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Erika Cellini from Wiki Movement Brazil and one of the organizers of WikiDataCon this year in partnership with Media Deutschland. And if you were here yesterday, then you already know me, but if not, it's nice to meet you in this room. This session is called Decolonizing the Internet Structured Data Follow-Up. So it means that this is a follow-up discussion of an event that we held a couple of weeks ago. And it's pretty clear from all the discussion that we had so far that this is a non-exhaustive topic. So I don't think, and I don't expect this conversation to stop here in the session, but the hope is that actually this kind of discussion continues throughout our movement. And it's very important to notice that if you haven't participated in this event with us, this is not a problem at all for joining this session, as we want to expand on the discussion that we had and get to know ideas from different places and perspectives. So yeah, I think I'll let you guys introduce yourself, or maybe I could just do a quick intro on what was the event. Yeah, I'll do that since I'm with the open mic here. So doing very briefly, this event was organized by Whose Knowledge and our friends working with education and open science at Wikimedia Deutschland. And it was also supported by us from Wiki Movement Brazil. It was one of the events supported through the Latin America and the Caribbean grant offered this year by the organization of WikiDataCon in order to prepare local communities to join not only the conference, but in our ecosystem in a meaningful and empowered way. And this event was a bit different from other proposals we received that were more focused on capacity building, as we were able to elaborate a deep discussion on how to decolonize structured data on the internet. And we tried to open avenues for our imaginations, and in the process, we gathered around 30 scholars and practitioners to think together what would structured data on the internet look like with multiple epistemic frames. And now I'll hand over for you guys to introduce yourselves, since I feel that I'm talking a lot. And please introduce yourselves to the audience.
Okay, I'm happy to continue. Thank you very much, Erika. Hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. A very warm welcome. My name is Sabine Müller. I'm at Wikimedia Deutschland. I come from a team that is called Education, Science and Culture. So I'm thinking more about questions that we're talking about here from, I guess, from an institutional point of view, but also from as a background. My background is in philosophy and literature, and narratology. So I've thought about that before. And for now, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and sharing thoughts. Or continue sharing thoughts. We had quite a lively discussion beforehand already, and I hand over to anyone who wants to follow.
I can go then. Hi guys, I'm Amanda. I come from Wiki Movement Brazil. I'm based in São Paulo. And my background is in communication. I am a scholar in communication studies. And I am very, very pleased to be part of this women gang that we formed to do this event, because this is amazing to work with you guys. And I hope to continue the conversation today with you all. And please feel free to write the answers, the questions on our shared Etherpad.
Hi, everyone, and hello again to my fabulous co-conspirators, Erika, Amanda, and Sabine. My name is Anastasia Sengupta, for those who haven't now heard far too much from me already at WikiDataCon. You know, one of the ways that I think we might open this conversation up, and Erika, Sabine, and Amanda, tell me if this is okay. I want to start just by talking about the process of how we did this pre-conference, because in all that we've been hearing in this track and across different sessions, I think we're coming back to the fact that in order to do this very nuanced set of conversations, how we do them is as important as what the substance of those conversations is. So perhaps I'll just start with a little bit of how we all together designed it, and then we can open up a little bit more around substance. Is that okay? Excellent. So, you know, one of the first things that we did was just the fact that we were collaborating together as three organizations who have a different set of positions within the movement, different perspectives, different responsibilities within the movement, different histories. Just that in itself, I think, was such an important way to begin, that it was a collaborative process between Wikimedia Deutschland, between Wikimovimento Brazil and Whose Knowledge. So I want to point out that just even that as a first step or as a foundational step was really important. Then we came together to think about what was most important to us in creating this pre-conference. We wanted to make sure that we were inviting, in particular, members of the Wikidata and Wikimedia community that are from Latin America and the Caribbean, because we know that many of them can feel very left out of some of these conversations, especially because of the languages that we often have our meta conversation. I find it very difficult now to use the word meta because I feel like Zuckerberg has taken it over. I'm very upset. Oh my goodness. You know, only Wikimedians can make meta jokes is what I think. But anyway, now we have a whole new set of memes. But we wanted to make sure that the languages were not just the usual languages, not just from the point of view of English, but also from the point of view of who's having the conversation. And I'll come back to that. And we wanted to make sure that as we have often done at Whose Knowledge in having different conversations around decolonizing the internet, we wanted to bring together what we call a set of unusual allies. That is, those who are not often in the room together, but who, when they come together, make a little bit of magic. And we also recognize that given that we have all been zoomed out of our minds, we wanted to have a conversation that was relatively short, but at the same time that had enough space for some of the nuances and complexities of structured data and Wikidata in particular. So what we then did was decide who we wanted to have, who was our wish list for this conversation. And I think that was one of the most exciting things we did, because we all brainstormed all the different people we wanted to see as part of this wish list, and then sort of honed it down. I think it was Sabina and Adeli who spent hours doing that at some point, which is a remarkable piece of work. And we came down to a combination of over 40, as Erika said, scholars, activists, techies, glam folks, community organizers, and many of whom have intersecting identities, of course. Most of whom came from or are based in the Global South, most of whom identified female, and most of whom were people of color, Black, Indigenous, and others of colors, as we like to say. I'm going to stop there because that's one set of conversations. Okay, I'd say one more thing, and then I would love everyone else to talk about process. The one thing that we thought was critical to have this conversation with the richness and textures of our many different contexts was to try and make it as multilingual as possible. That, for us, from the start, was critical. And if you look at our grant report to Wikimovimento Brazil, who supported this process, essentially the entire grant is on translation and interpretation, right? So we knew that we wanted it in at least 3 different languages. recognizing, of course, that all those 3 languages are colonial languages, but we had our conversation with simultaneous interpretation in English, Spanish, and in Portuguese. And just even that, even to make it trilingual, I think brought a flavor and a power to the conversation that would never have been possible if we were just making it monolingual, whatever that monolingual is. And as we know, as we are embodying in this conversation, it's most often English. So I'll stop there. Sabina, do you want to sort of add to process?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. Sorry about that.
I think we just have to make sure that we pass the baton.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So I think you said a lot about the most of the process, which I thought was crucial in setting up the entire conversation and thinking it up. And I just wanted to add that you cannot stress enough how important it is to think about these things that you just pointed out in the process before, in order to make a conversation happen in a space that is open and creative and re-imaginative or imaginative and just free. And I think that worked very well. But I also wanted to say, or maybe just describe briefly how we ran through the session, which was fabulously held by Anasuya and Adili. And what we kicked off the session with a welcome and an introduction, of course, but with a panel that we called Perspectives and Provocations, which we were very lucky to have Lydia Pincher, which everybody knows, obviously, Matakari Williams, who comes from the Matakutonga Ministry of Culture and Heritage. I'm sorry for stumbling here. Tech activist Paz Pena and Stacey Ellison and Casey Kaysen from the University of Toronto, who actually gave their ideas about questions, and I'm reading them out because I'm still fascinated about them. What does structured data mean to you? That is the starting point, of course, but what does epistemic justice and multiple epistemologies mean to you with connection with structured data? What is your perspective on multiple epistemics, and what does it mean to you? And finally, if you had to provoke us to think about one aspect of structured data differently than we do today, what would that be? And with the ideas of our speakers, we went into breakout sessions. And in these breakout sessions, we actually tried to reimagine the thought hard and discussed hard and exchanged vividly and committedly about how we would reimagine the internet 2014 with structured data that were anchored in multiple epistemologies. So that was quite an adventure, and so that the adventure could be brought back to the plenary session, we had designated listeners. So we continued after the breakout sessions with people reporting, the listeners reporting back what they heard in the session. And then all together we thought about next steps. So how do we get into actions? This is actually also a question I already saw in the Etherpad. So what are the actions? Which is difficult. And we had talked about that before. So that would be, I thought what was particularly helpful is exactly the topic of listening. So having listeners reporting back, having people reporting the different voices and viewpoints had also its place in the conversation itself. So I just thought that was amazing and worked tremendously. So this was much more on the process. So I just wanted to look at my conspirators, whether you have more on the topic of organization and process that you think is important for this conversation.
Yes, definitely, because one thing that we should mention here is the mood of the room during the session, because throughout these last couple of years, people are super tired of getting to meet people just for the screen. And at some point, I was very worried about that because we were gathering so many people from so different time zones and backgrounds. But in the end, the event just went so fast and everything was so... I'll take the liberty to be a bit more slow and spacious today because, English is not my first language and I'm struggling here because, Wikidata is huge. I'm doing several roles here. But anyway, what I'm saying is that people are tired of being on the screen, and we were able to promote an environment where everyone felt so welcomed and so connected to each other. And I'm talking of people that never seen each other. Some of them, of course, they were already connected some way, but the general mood was that. And I think that it was part of our methodology there to select the people and how we conduct the invitation for them, because it was very human, although we were trying to go to some tough discussions on internet structure, data, etc. This can be harsh, and at the same time, we were feeling so light in the room, like trying to change the world. And this is just one thing that I wanted to share with you guys that are watching us, because I see here that many people who joined us here at this room today was not at the event. So I think that this is important to mention how was the mood in the room.
And also to mention the opportunity to speak in Portuguese. I did speak in Portuguese to use the work of our translators, wonderful translators, by the way. And we think much better in our natural language. Then it is so powerful to have these tools and to have the support. And before, on Ana Suya's speech, a little bit before, I forgot the name of the person that talked about this, because not of Ana Suya. I think I lost my connection. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, it was on the João's speech, and he translated a guy in French, and this guy was saying about how necessary it is to promote this conversations in multiple languages for people to, because we do speak English, we do understand English, but to speak our hearts in English is really hard and harsh. And it takes a time. If you live in a country that you speak English all the time, then you can start thinking a little bit better in English. But when you live in Portuguese, for example, that is my situation, it is hard to put your heart on another language. So it is important to have these conversations in other possible languages. And I feel very, very grateful for us to be able to organize this event with the multilingual language. We wish we could do more languages, but I hope in the future we will be able to. So it was very welcoming.
And I wonder whether one very quick thing about language, because it's come up so often in WikiDataCon already, and it's such a key way of how we express ourselves in the world. Even though we knew we wanted to make it multilingual in at least English, Portuguese, and Spanish, what we did do was to ask people before they joined us, before the actual event, what language they might want to be, they would be most comfortable in case we had a critical mass in some other language that we could provide. So we tried to, we knew that, resources are limited, but even with limited resources, we did our best to be somewhat flexible. And for instance, we thought we may offer French as well, but we didn't need to, because the couple of French speakers who joined us were comfortable enough in English that they were fine with being in English group. So just again, process and limited resources, if you have a little imagination and flexibility, you can stretch them a while. I'm also wondering, because the four of us have been talking a bit, I know that Lydia is here, and I know that Stacy is here, and I'm trying to see if there is anyone else who was here from the the pre-conference, but I'm wondering if we can invite Lydia and Stacey to talk a little bit about what it felt like for them, so that we can move into the substantive, both in terms of feeling and idea. What was the conversation like for them? Lydia, would you like to go first, or Stacey? Either of you? Just putting you on the spot, I understand, so feel free to turn me down, but it would be lovely to hear from both of you.
I'll try. Let me start my camera. Yeah, so it was a pleasure to join the event, and it was really great to see so many people put so much thought and dedication into the topic of making Wikidata better and making representation of various people in structured data across the web better. It was really, really cool, and I enjoyed it a lot. Stacey?
Thanks, Lydia. Well, firstly, I just want to really express my thanks to the organizers. I was really so excited to see this happening, and such a decolonizing structured data be such a big part of WikiDataCon, and moving, I think, more deliberately into thinking about these issues across the community. So huge thanks to everybody who, and especially those here now, for all of that work. And I will say I want to extend also my thanks even to people who aren't here, who participated, because it's really about having those conversations together and sharing those ideas that just are so exciting. I know we often, it always feels a bit funny to say we want to change the world, but really, really that's what it's about. And it was such a pleasure to have those conversations. And, I think it's, I guess I'm thinking about what do I want to express now in this context. And I think it's exciting. And I think then the next challenge is for the wider community. We had how we do this in practice, and how we bring these conversations about what this means to have multiple epistemologies, or how we think about, from both a technical standpoint, but also that cultural way of working, and that we tend, I'll just say I've worked with students who have things deleted sometimes because there's not appropriate references and from Wikidata. And so we have to think about things like, what do we mean by a notable reference? What do we mean by what, really at that base level of how knowledge is valued, if we really want to think about bringing these multiple contexts into Wikidata, and to think about that context as well in the, I guess, that friction point, between Wikidata and having those conversations about Wikibase. So I guess that's my my thoughts and some questions that I'm thinking about right now. And how do we educate or bring everybody along in these conversations? Because we know, working in an international context, it can be a challenge sometimes. But as I said, I'm really thrilled that these conversations are happening.
Lydia, not to put you on the spot again, and it feels like I've gone back to being interviewer, but especially given how much of the complexity you hold, you have, let me put it as a progressive panopticon view, right, of the movement, especially around Wikidata and Wikibase with Sam. What excited you about this conversation that we had? And what did you think were possible ways forward from the different voices that you heard?
Yeah, I especially appreciated that it felt like a safe space where we can bring up all of those issues that Wikidata has. Because, we all know this, right? Wikidata is amazing, but just like everything has its problems and challenges, and that's okay as long as we can work with that and approach it in a meaningful way. And I think what was really great in those conversations, and what is also reflected here now in all these conversations we're having this weekend, is that it feels like people are approaching it from a very positive and proactive angle, as opposed to just griping about how everything is terrible, because that is, I think, not moving us forward, right? That is not a place where from which I think we want to work. We want to work from a place of making things better, and I think that is what we have achieved. And yeah, I think the really interesting question is now, how do we take some of that energy and those ideas and make them reality to make Wikidata better, which is what we all want here, right? And in terms of concrete things, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is this idea of references, and Stacey was just talking about having items deleted for reasons of missing references and so on. And I think this is a very concrete thing where we could better understand why are people currently deleting items, right? Because on the one hand, we have those items that Stacey's students are creating and that probably should be in Wikidata and that deserve to be represented there. And on the other hand, we have people creating items on Wikidata where I think we collectively would say, maybe they don't need to be on Wikidata. And a ton of search engine optimization work, for example, is going on there that maybe we don't want to support as a community, right? And being able to tease that apart and make it clearer what of these contributions is actually harmful to the project and what of that is actually really beneficial and what we want might be a good next step to make some of that better.
That's such a good point, and I would love to come back to it, but I want to check in with Sabine and Amanda and Erica if you had any thoughts and responses to what Lydia and Stacey just said.
I remember something that Lydia told us during the event. I think it was wrapping up the discussion, is that Wikidata and Wikibase aren't perfect, but there's a lot of opportunities to be explored there that aren't being deeply explored so far. And if we want this data to have impact and reach out to people, then the data needs to work with people building these tools and other applications too. And for me, that also means that we constantly have to keep thinking about how to make sure that this data is being reused by other communities, and how we are connecting with smaller communities as well, and making sure that they have the resources enough to be, how do I say that? To get sovereignty over their knowledges and over the data that is being there, that address there, that speaks about their local culture, about their local knowledges, etc. And we don't have a closed answer yet, but I think that this effort of bringing so many people from so many different places and backgrounds and making the hard questions and trying to bring this to a materiality, especially in places like, in opportunities like this one, WikidataCon, and all this process that we've been doing before the conference itself, is a good starting point. And I really love the good allies that we have here, and to see that people are open for the discussion. So this is my 2 cents on it, and I think that this is a very hopeful speech that I have, although we know it seems like the world is ending and that the relations on the internet are just a reflection of it, but there's a lot of cool people trying to do things even in smaller scales, and I think that this is super important to highlight that we understand that structured data is something very political in essence, because it's a means of connecting with the world and trying to translate the world through data. But at the same time, it's super helpful for us to look at local examples and work with local communities, because it's from there that we can maybe replicate experiences and share our knowledges and bring together this wider community. So for me, the key aspect of it is obviously thinking about it critically and trying to engage as many people as we want. The good allies and the people who usually are not in this circle of conversations, of course, but at the same time, talking on an institutional point of view, we also need resources for make this work actually happen and for actually bring people to this. So I think that during this whole process of organizing WikiDataCon and getting to know more about these local communities, especially here in Latin America and the Caribbean, the main thing is that how do we make sure to offer this infrastructure for them, for making sure that they are connected with people that can support them as well, and making sure that they also have autonomy on the data and on the activities that they are organizing locally too. So I think that this is my 2 cents and my this unrest that I have from all the discussion that we are having so far.
I totally agree with you, Erika, and I would add that the event itself made me feel very hopeful, and I like to make a joke that here in Brazil we don't feel hopeful a lot these days, and this is a joke, but it's ironic, but it's true. But I felt really hopeful in the event because everyone was so open, so willing to think about other perspectives, other possible futures. And I think in this event, these gatherings, we can find the strength to keep going and to keep inserting other people, to keep bringing more people into the conversation. And I think it's absolutely that what Erika said about having resources to put these people into conversation, because it's not that.
Oh no, we lost Amanda.
I'm sorry.
There you are.
My internet was perfect all the event. Now that I need to appear here, I am so sorry. But we saw in practice how difficult it is to reach out to people in the Global South, because we don't have the same infrastructure, we don't have the same internet, as you can see. and it's difficult to reach out to these people. So how can we build infrastructures to let these people into the conversation? I think that's something we have to think about.
Yeah, I would like to add to that or follow up on that, because what I find fascinating is that the range of questions and topics we opened up in this conversation, and it was a teaser, and I feel it was a teaser because actually we opened the whole range from concrete questions of data models and logics to specific ethics, like structuring around specific data around specific communities, which I find is on a more concrete level, up to the questions of attitude and approaching the way we know things, or the attitude we approach usefulness. That was a discussion before. So when we think about useful, we are already in a certain system of thinking. So how do we create space and create spaciousness to be able to reimagine things, rather than thinking about the challenges and the obstacles, which is also a whole set of language that is very common to the in the context we work, if I may say. So whatever they express or hide, I leave that open. So I think this entire range of ideas and ways of tackle the issue were opened up in the open conversation. And now I guess different communities can pick and choose them, maybe not, to kind of think about and continue and follow up about certain approaches. And then hopefully we come together, and the next conversation is a bit further. But the important thing is that it brings together the very broad way that we have to think about the complexity of the issue, because it's about data, but it's not just about data, but about much more, about culture, narratives, frames, cognitive frames, and so on and so on. And yeah, that is something I wanted to add. I also wanted to add, because we had it today, there was a topic I thought was very interesting. It talked about fugitivity rather than inclusion, not thinking about we include people, but rather we have to escape what we have now in order to get something new. So all these patterns of trying to express something that is different, radically different, perhaps even, is crucial, and is opened up in the way we hold a conversation, which probably brings me back to processes, which is my area of expertise, I suppose. I don't know. Yeah. I don't want to, I just wanted to open up, and I was wondering whether we should also look at the Etherpad and the conversations in the chat, but I don't want to cut short anyone who wanted to say something on the panel here. Otherwise, I invite people who voice their questions or comments if they want to. They don't have to, obviously. And I'm not sure if I have everything in view. So there is a question, the first question on the Etherpad. Does the person who wrote this want to voice it here? Otherwise, I'm happy to read it out as well. So maybe I read it out. Everybody happy with that? Decolonization is necessarily contextual, then decolonizing structured data is necessarily contextual. How is it understood from your perspective? Moreover, how does it reflect upon an actual action from your organization? So I guess it means each of our organizations and each of our perspectives. So does anybody want to start or take this question?
I love that there's silence. Let's just take that and sit with it for a bit. I'm hoping it was a thoughtful, not an uncomfortable silence, though I will also say discomfort is good. Discomfort is a place of movement. And actually, I think that's where I want to start. Decolonizing and all the different unpacking of the different systems of oppression that we've already talked about should and is uncomfortable. It should not be frightening. It shouldn't be paralyzing, but it actually is uncomfortable. And I think we need to be okay with that. We need to be okay with discomfort and recognize that it is a really important signal for ways to be better, as Lydia said, and to do better. So I think I want to say that for us, at least at Whose Knowledge, we try and live our work and do our work in a combination of discomfort and joy. Because I think you can have joy while you're uncomfortable or you're in discomfort. And the discomfort is that we are always self-examining we're always asking ourselves the question about who holds power in what ways and how. How are we holding power? How are we being bottlenecks of power? How are we preventing others from having agency and joy and affirmation in a particular conversation? What are the ways in which we can hold and convene and support, but not overwhelm? And it's always a dance, right? Because Stacey, I think, put it really well when we were talking during the pre-conference. These are conversations that need intentionality. They need resources of time, of money, of labor. Our labor is often taken very much for granted in these conversations. And at the same time, you want to recognize that those who are not yet in the conversation need different forms of support to be in the conversation. And then you want to sort of step aside, right? And how do you step aside with respect and in solidarity? So again, I know I've used this word very many times. I'm a stuck gramophone record. It's in practice. It's in practice of that dance between discomfort and comfort, ease and joy that I think the work is done. For us, for instance, just the way that we organize this pre-conference is a form of our expressing our politics around these issues. Just the fact that we know we needed to have this conversation. We knew, for instance, Stacey and I have been having this conversation for years now. Lydia, you and I have been having this conversation for years now. And so many others in the movement. So both to affirm others in the movement who've been having this conversation, but also recognizing that the moment has come to start having a much more intentional set of conversations that lead to action. Because the other thing that I think is going to be very, very painful for all of us who are in this conversation is to see any of these conversations, whether it is, Erica, this track of reimagining Wikidata from the margins, or our decolonizing structured data conversation, or any of the conversations, Stacey, you've held in the past, to see them as one-off conversations that then fall into the void of no action, right? Of nothingness. We definitely don't want to be there. And so one of the things I hope that we all collectively commit to is putting the resources, the effort, and the time behind an ongoing set of conversations that can lead to action. And Lydia, like you said, there are some very basic things that we can start with. We can start with, I mean, I know we call it basic, and I know it will, of course, be a whole lot of fun, but conversations around notability and reliability of source. I mean, these are such critical conversations. Just in the wonderful presentation before with Daniele and Chiara, the ability to move to a default that is more plural than less, right? More plural than heteronormative, moving to parent than father or mother. What an extraordinary thing that we fight describing the parental role as parent rather than a heteronormative mother or father. The fact that, year after year, we have fought that. We've managed to get to sibling, but we haven't got to parent, right? So just recognizing that our movement really needs to embody that practice in both small and large ways and in ongoing ways.
Just saying some words about this difficult question. I think that, at least for us at Wikimove Brazil, I think I can say for the organization, we need to start decolonizing our own minds, and especially coming from where we come with the colonized mind. Sometimes it's hard to realize how these power relations are being replicated in our actions too. So be mindful of the power relations that go usually unnoticed in our practices when editing Wikidata, for example. Being critical of the kind of data we're uploading there, for example, or for example, are we uploading an empowering set of knowledge or just replicating colonial knowledge disguised as the neutral norm? You know, so this is the kind of questions that we need to do constantly in our practices, which again is super local and is also about dealing with our own controversies, with this discomfort of doing the work that we do and recognizing our own limitations and the areas in which we can support each other, not only in Brazil, in our community, but also connecting with people in similar contexts and coming from the colonized world as well. So I think in a couple of words, that would be my answer to it.
I'm just going to pop in on this, even though I'm not representing an organization per se, but, you know, something I think about this question and about thinking through these ideas is that when we talk about decolonization, what do we really mean? And I always go back to sort of like, I'm sure some people might hear, no, Tuck and Yang's decolonization is not a metaphor. And that means it does have to be grounded in like, what is the action of decolonization and how do we actually think about, it's not that we're just changing some terminology, right? It is actually embodying or returning the rights of Indigenous people, for example, returning, you know, colonization is also an act of destruction of epistemologies. And so when we return or recognize or remove colonial names from people or lands, that is really important. And we do that in a myriad of ways. And so we do that in our physical spaces, but it should be reflected in our online spaces as well. And so, you know, I think it is important to recognize the weight that carries, right? It is recognizing people, but it's also recognizing presence in territory and recognizing that there isn't one kind of knowledge. And we talk a lot about it, I think, sometimes in these conversations, but to understand the importance of what that means and linking that decolonization to, you know, I'm in Canada. We have a big movement here of land back. there's a hashtag, but you know, it is political and it is vital. And we think about aligning. You know, also in the movement, we have a lot of talks about, you know, the SDGs or UNESCO. Well, what about, you know, the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and linking up, you know, the work that we do in Wikidata with actually the articles set out in UNDRIP, for example. Like, we should be able to find some space of commonality there.
So maybe because I have a look at the time, I would move on and read one or two more questions from the Etherpad, if that's okay. So there is one follow-up question on the context. What other interactions have happened that have led us to this meeting? What are relevant conferences, discussions you were engaged before that make this meeting meaningful? I think some were already mentioned, perhaps, because we all have discussion, I guess, in a lot of different directions in our work context, in our communities, Wikidata community. And what made it meaningful was also the people that were there with all their backgrounds. So maybe I move on to another very interesting comment with a question, or several questions actually. Technology itself is never neutral. Aren't the technical structures underlying Wikidata and structured data themselves potential instruments of exclusion and oppression on a basic level? The subject-predicate-object syntax in RDF, for example, reflects a conceptual and cognitive bias that privileges a particular way of knowing over others. Ontologies and taxonomies as methods of knowledge organization are rooted in Western notions of epistemology, and yet these methods are the core of Wikidata as a platform. And there's the question, what does it mean to rethink structured data without making a radical break with existing systems and approaches? Here's an easy one.
I guess I can say a word about that. Yes, technology is never neutral. And Wikidata's underlying technology, Wikibase, isn't neutral. There is a lot of design decisions that went into Wikidata that do exclude certain types of knowledge and that shape the project and what it can take in. Absolutely. I think there are, on the other hand, also many design decisions that make that make it possible to incorporate much more knowledge than in some other systems that are being used. And it's definitely not perfect, right? But what we have is providing a useful base for applications and services that people use every day today, right? And I think we can decide to help improve that system, make that system better, or decide not to be a part of that system. Both of those choices are valid choices, right? I am very much on the side of making Wikidata better and more inclusive and so on, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And I appreciate all the thoughtful conversations we've had over the last years since we started Wikidata about how to do that, and I think we need to continue that. But yes, as you said, technology is never neutral, and we need to be aware of that.
I love that, and I just want to sort of reiterate that also because I'm looking at Paulo's comment and just wanting again to say gently that there is really no such thing as neutrality, and we all of us as Wikimedians need to recognize that whatever the decisions we are making, whether technological, social, cultural, epistemological, there is a certain power with which we make those decisions. There is no neutrality. So the world as it is the world that we're talking about right now, Paulo, not the world as it should be. The world is oppressive to every one of us on this panel in multiple ways, right? And we know this. The one thing that I'm going to add is that when you bring people together who can reimagine taxonomies and technologies that support those taxonomies in very different ways, right? Then we can start sort of really doing this interesting plurality of systems, both what we have right now, as well as new ways. One of the examples that came up in the conference that I want to bring here, because I think it's very useful, is the Papareo language recognition model of the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this was a speech recognition project set up by a group of Maori radio engineers, techies, and community organizers, and they have made that process entirely sovereign to the community. And their sovereignty is both to reject proprietary companies coming to ask them for the data set, and also, and interestingly, to reject the open tech community, because their point is that even open tech is not accessible to their communities. So they want to make sure that there is sovereignty of the data set. So what does sovereign data sets mean, and how are ways in which those sovereign data sets, what are the ontologies for those sovereign data sets? We could learn so much from from efforts like that that can help us rethink and reimagine together.
So I assume the role of looking at the time, which is nearly over. We have 1 more minute, but we have also 1 more comment in the Etherpad, and I would like to read it out. Culture is political. The privilege on display on Wikidata is a problem. We can have a decolonized knowledge, but it would require a culture capable of listening to marginalized cultures. Crowdsourcing is inherently the volunteer labor of the leisure class. Why then should this class expect the same labor from those not of their class? Grab first, then ethics. This is wonderful and just opens up an entirely new aspect of the entire complexity that we are talking about. Why should people contribute and participate in making better what a certain privileged community has started? Not sure we can answer it, but maybe one last word.
I think it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, I mean, maybe I took over what Stacey might have wanted to say, but I keep coming back to what Stacey said in the conference, which is, this is why we need resources, not just for us as the privileged few to do this work, but to recognize that the people we want to do this reimagining with us are not people who have the resources to do them right now.